I like to think of what Louis Armstrong said about music. There's only two kinds of music, good and bad.
Imagine, if you will, a city, a golden city, a city whose name is as shrouded in myth as its streets are in mist, a city poised on the edge of the old world, and that edge is spinning further away, its history being eaten at by fashionable invention and a fashionable shame for the sins of the long dead which built the finery that once adorned it. Congo Square, the foreboding symbol of the city's shame, once sat virtually on the same spot as Louis Armstrong Park, named for the largest looming symbol of the city's pride. It is a city that, like the river that runs through it, carries the elements of 1,000 streams, blending them and discharging them into a vast sea. It is the city that care forgot and that the world forgives, a city which abdicated its position as the capital of American romance and descended to a capital of American degradation and loss, a vanishing city, both under myth and misfortune. It is a musical city, perhaps the greatest musical city in the world, a city where the greatest American music was born and where now it seemingly exists only as a pale and emasculated fodder for tourists. This is New Orleans, and this is the story of its four kings. Logic and laziness tend to suggest that jazz is the little brother or the first cousin of the blues. It isn't. It's more like the rowdy neighbour who breaks into the blues' house all the time and borrows stuff it doesn't ever really return. And of course, jazz also lives next door to the church house and the concert hall and the whorehouse and city hall. And that neighbourhood which nascent jazz was able to ransack was thrown together through accidents of racism, spoils of war, bad town planning, and blurred and distant geopolitics in the blink of an eye. While the blues was a slow accretion, an evolution over hundreds of years and two continents, jazz rose through a series of accidents, a music made by the fallout of the Tower of Babel and emerged seemingly whole-born within about 7 years. Behind jazz, as there is behind the blues, the deep and dismal story of slavery dwells, and within that the attempts to keep alive the multifarious threads of cultures dragged with the slave ship stands as a secret beacon which kept alive the humanity and the mental vestiges of freedom. The last thing I want to do here is apply or assay any form of moral equivalency around the different stripes and flavours of slavery. I just want to ascribe in a very short period of time the broad causes, circumstances and coincidences which, through slavery, made New Orleans the birthplace of jazz. Africans first arrived in New Orleans in 1719, a mere year after the foundation of the city. In 1724, it was decreed that slavery in Louisiana was to be regulated under the legal framework of Code Noir. Code Noir, in short, was 60 articles which laid down the limitations of actions on slave owners and the obligations for the care, work and punishment as necessary of slaves. It was first applied in the West Indies in 1687. The code covered rules around slave marriage, sexual relations and children, prohibited actions, the requirement of how owners were to treat slaves, how slaves were to be freed and what rights they would enjoy after manumission. While still intolerably cruel and degrading, Code Noir was still considerably more humane than the various other codes which governed the rest of the USA. It also led to some interesting concessions that helped make the cultural lives for Louisiana slaves richer and more open to merging with other influences. For example, under Code Noir, slaves did not work on Sundays. Ostensibly, this was so they could go to church, but that still left them Sunday afternoons, which they put to use either running businesses. Slaves could have their own businesses as long as it didn't involve selling sugarcane, performing as paid entertainers, or socializing at mass dances held in Congo Square, which the other 6 days of the week was the site of notorious slave auctions. Benjamin Latrobe wrote colourful descriptions of these dances which survived in Congo Square until about 1870. The New Orleans City Council in 1817 specifically dedicated the square for African American dancers in an almost unheard of act of toleration when other states were banning the use of drums and horns by slaves, and less formally for 15 years or so after 1870, which coincides with the emergence of local marching bands and subsequently jazz music. New Orleans was also the great melting pot of American society in the years up to World War I. Not just the French dominated, it retained strong notes of Spanish culture as well as German. The characteristic New Orleans accent yat has a strong German Yiddish root similar to a Brooklyn accent. Dutch, Scottish, Irish and Italian as well as Native American and Eastern immigration, as well as a broad selection of African American backgrounds. Slaves had arrived direct from Africa, relocated from the Caribbean, freeborn African Americans and emancipated slaves. Another advantage of Code Noir was that slave masters were required to educate the children of slaves. Plus, no-work Sundays meant the Sunday school was available to children and adults alike, and that meant that the opportunity to employ themselves meant there was a viable black economy interacting with local commercial economy. Combined with the 20-year manumission clauses in Code Noir, this meant there was a relatively large number of educated, economically independent, and free African Americans in New Orleans' community. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, 15% of New Orleans' population was free African Americans. At the start of the Civil War, it was just over 20%, while for the neighboring state of Mississippi, it was less than 2%. Being a predominantly Catholic city, New Orleans' music was not as influenced by hymnody as was music in the predominantly Protestant states, so the music wasn't bound to the rigid song formats we later readily recognize as the blues. It's a very different music from the blues you'd hear in, again, neighboring Mississippi. Also in common with what we'd like to pigeonhole as the blues, the call and response format derives, so they say, from social messaging systems set across the fields, which was structured and formalized by hypnotic influence into the vocal basis for the blues, whereas in jazz, which is primarily an instrumental form, it became the basis for the riff-based verses and the back-and-forth nature of soloing. For the sake of brevity, the final huge differentiator between New Orleans music and the blues is the influence of Spanish music on jazz, particularly that brought by emigres from Cuba. Jelly Roll Morton called it the Spanish tinge. This rhythmic form, based on the habanera and tresillo dance music, was a duple pulse beat which Morton claims, and Morton claimed a lot of things, to have altered by adding syncopation, thus giving New Orleans music its customary drive and swing. This largely discounts, however, the influence of ragtime, a form that's been floating around since before the Civil War, before being finally codified around the end of the 19th century. Melodically stilted but rhythmically manic, it's impossible not to believe that musicians travelling on riverboats, either as entertainers or having taken other work on the boats, did not bring a ragtime influence downriver with them after trips to the epicenter of the genre, St. Louis. It's been posited by Ted Gioia in his seminal History of Jazz that ragtime was a greater influence on jazz in New Orleans than was the blues. Jazz began to emerge as New Orleans entered a period of decline. The city's population had quadrupled between 1825 and 1875, but was devastated by a yellow fever epidemic in 1878, and disease and pestilence were so rampant that the average life expectancy for a white person in 1880 was 46 years, and for a black person 36 years. Infant mortality sat at 45%. Is it any wonder that the city developed an obsession with funerals, memorials, parades, and parties? In an almost unique merger of the rituals of the profound and the profane, jazz began to emerge across the city, in the squares, in the streets, in the churches, and in the fetid front rooms of the bar rooms and bordellos of Fayetteville, Storeyville, perhaps the most famous red light district in the world. Americans have a seemingly inordinate need to decorate their musicians with the trappings and titles of royalty. As jazz emerged, one figure rose to the forefront of the new music, playing as he did in parades and at picnics at parks and union halls and the honky-tonks that dotted the neighborhood around City Hall. His name, say it in a reverent whisper, was Buddy Bolden, and he was the first of the four kings. Bolden was a shadowy figure. He left no recorded legacy, and there's only one photograph of someone thought to be him. His name never appeared in print until 2 years after he died. His legend is based on two factors. First was that he was the first musician on the scene to improvise solos. Most likely this was because he couldn't read music and, due to his drinking or illness, would frequently forget what he'd learned by rote and he'd have to go his own way. Between half a dozen and 10 years, Bolden and his band laid down many of the foundations, not only of jazz, but of wider African-American music. His contemporaries, when interviewed many years later, recalled him as cocky and a hard taskmaster for his bands, even to improvising not only solos over older songs, but also improvising scatological lyrics, frequently aimed at city officials. One song, known variously as the Buddy Bolden Stomp, Buddy Bolden's Blues, I Thought I Heard Buddy Bolden Say, or Funky Butt, would get you arrested if a police officer heard you sing it on the street. Bolden and his band naturally played in the seedy quarters of Storeyville, but their music didn't come from there. It came via Bolden from the church, specifically the Holy Roller Baptist Church on Franklin and Jackson. Bolden would crib ideas he heard at the church, particularly about his riff, and he worked on adapting vocal tones to his horn that he and his band would then work through in less high-minded venues.
But his accomplishment and innovations were to lay the basis for not only an enduring American music, but an enduring mythos and code amongst its musicians. In short, these were that he was the first New Orleans street musician to begin to improvise his solos. Players played faster and with greater technical proficiency before Bolden, but Bolden was the one who broke the music away from its classical bias in rote reading pieces to playing them, as they say, the way Buddy Bolden felt them. Bolden also introduced the single most defining element in the move from jazz away from being a march music to being a dance music, the big 4 beat, which gave the beat much more space for dancers and was the basis of huge swathes of African American music, from Bo Diddley's Hambone to James Brown's Super Funk to Tony Williams's polyrhythmic masterclasses from 1967 to 68 with Miles Davis. Witnesses were inconsistent as to Bolden's tone. Some say he played sweet and languid, others say that he played hard and clipped, but they all agree on one thing: he played loud. It's probable his musical vocabulary went both ways, as he was also famous for pioneering the all-nighter, furious dance music until midnight, and then slow, bluesy grinds to the dawn. In 5 years from around 1901 to 1906, Buddy Bolden wrote the rule book for jazz and became its king.
Bolden's reign as king ended after a precipitous fall. Through 1905 and 1906, Bolden's behaviour became increasingly erratic, and he began to face high turnover in his band. Worse still, the arrests for assault and disorderly behaviour began to mount up. This was blamed on his mounting intake of drink, but that only masked a more serious problem. He made his last ever public appearance as a musician on Labour Day in 1906, but he couldn't finish his set. By 1907, he was committed to the State Insane Asylum in Jackson, Louisiana. Full-blown schizophrenia set in, and he spent the rest of his days there dying forgotten in 1931, aged 54. Bolden's successor as king was another mysterious and ornery figure, the fearsome Freddy Keppard. Keppard and Bolden's career were to some extent inextricably intertwined, even though it's very possible the two men never met. What is clear that Keppard, his own self-publicity notwithstanding, was a phenomenal musician, master of all manner of stringed instruments before picking up the cornet and within a year organising the Olympia Orchestra, a hot dance band, in 1905 at the age of 15. The Olympia was a Creole band, so they had to play the downtown society crowd one night and then head uptown to play the hot jazz. It wasn't actually called jazz until 1916 or so, later that evening. After a few years with the Olympia, Keppard, no doubt spurred by his legendary ego, joined Frankie Dussault's Eagle Band, the renamed Buddy Bolden Band, taking Bolden's place on cornet. Keppard's style was, they say, very close to Bolden's. Fearful of other musicians stealing his riff, he took to playing with a handkerchief across his left hand. By the turn of the decade, he was being billed as King Keppard. In late 1911, bassist Bill Johnson arranged a touring outfit to take the New Orleans sound to Los Angeles and thence Chicago and New York. Keppard agreed to the tour, billed as a star cornetist. He lit out on the road and was seldom back in New Orleans after that. Besides some desultory notices in the New York papers, the tour was a huge success. RCA Victor in 1915 offered to make the original Creole band the first recorded jazz group, but Keppard demurred, citing fear that folks would steal his stuff, and also cocking a snoot at the $25 flat recording fee, declaring he drank more than $25 worth of gin a day. Jazz wasn't recorded until 1917, when a group of white Italian musicians called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band recorded the ODJB one-step and Livery Stable Blues in Camden, New Jersey. Livery Stable Blues was an old Freddy Keppard song. Also in 1917, some say 1918, in Chicago, Keppard lost his crown as king to Joe Oliver after a cutting contest, a one-on-one jam session with the winner declared by the crowd. He had another 3 good years, though, as the original Creole band still toured relentlessly. But as New Orleans celebrated a new king, the old king gradually succumbed to alcoholism and tuberculosis, dying forgotten by all but a young kid called Louis Armstrong, who would always visit every time he came through Chicago until Keppard passed away in July 1933, aged only 43 years. Joe Oliver was one of the most profoundly influential musicians of all time. A brilliant cornetist who added velocity and fluidity to the lexicon of the New Orleans players, it was he who completed the pioneering work of Keppard in spreading jazz truly nationwide and became, along with Bessie Smith, the first maker of truly modern-sounding jazz records, standards that are still played today. His career began when he was 27 years old, playing in increasingly more sophisticated marching bands and co-fronting a group with Kid Ory, which was in demand for its hot dance music both uptown and down. It was a brawl that started at one of Oliver's gigs in Storeyville that precipitated the Navy coming in and clearing the entire area, from Basin Street to the St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery, in 1917. The loss of work from the closure of the cat houses led to a diaspora of musicians from NO, largely to Chicago and St. Louis. Oliver packed his wife with his daughter, the rather superbly named Ruby Tuesday Oliver, and his cornet, and lit out for Chicago. Almost immediately upon arriving, legend has it, Oliver began taunting Freddy Keppard for the crown. There were other contenders at the time too: Buddy Petit, Emmett Hardy, Mutt Carey. Almost no one's ever heard of, or in some cases like Hardy, never even heard. And by 1918 he had it won, beating Keppard in a playoff and sentencing the former king to a slow and lonely decline. Oliver threw himself into recovering all of Keppard's old turf. Chicago, unsuccessful at first trips to New York and California, all the while picking up the best of his hometown musicians. The brothers Johnny and Baby Dodds on clarinet and drums, the irrepressible Honoré Dutre on trombone, and one of the great women of jazz, Lil Hardin, on piano. But in July 1922, Oliver did something unheard of when he hired a second cornetist, a challenger to his star power, into the band. He sent a telegram to New Orleans to his 21-year-old protege and eventual successor, Louis Armstrong, asking for his immediate attendance in Chicago. Thus was born one of the great partnerships in American music. Oliver was not just a teacher and a guide to Armstrong, he was a surrogate father, and the band The Family that Louis so keenly longed for. Born in 1901 to a wastrel father and a 17-year-old mother, his father soon abandoned the family and his mother headed to Storeyville to earn a living, abandoning Louis to the care of an ailing grandmother. At 12, he was sent to the waifs' home on a charge of disturbing the peace. He got 18 months and emerged a changed young man, the structure and the discipline of the home having taught him a valuable lesson. His cornet playing had come ahead in leaps and bounds. Brass instruments were always pretty cheap to come by in New Orleans because of the vast number looted from Cuba after the Spanish-American War of 1898. He went to work at backbreaking labour, hauling and delivering coal through Storeyville, and he was probably the only musician in town who was happy to see the place torn down. While many musicians left town after Storeyville fell, Armstrong stuck around and found good gigs for a promising musician plentiful, most notably taking Joe Oliver's vacated spot in Kid Ory's band and a place with Honoré Dutre's brother Sam's Silverleaf band. The sound of those old records notwithstanding, Oliver, Armstrong, Dutre and Dodds made extraordinary music, engaging in the almost telepathic interplay, especially the moments of counterpoint, which became such a speciality it became almost a byword for their sound. The two cornets, Oliver's with his short, punchy fragments and subtle variations, the last sounding of the Buddy Bolden style, before gluing them together into guttural, hard-driving solos, and Armstrong with the then unheard-of concept of swing, that knowledge of not just where the beat was, but where one fraction of a second off the beat was, and his beautifully unique sense of phrasing made him not only jazz's then greatest soloist, but very possibly its most influential ever. Oliver and Armstrong were not only the peak of New Orleans jazz, but they were also its final golden sunset. The band split up because Oliver was a terrible money manager and the other cats suspected him of swindling them. Louis Armstrong and Little Hardin were married in 1924. They stuck it out until 1925, but Louis never forgot Papa Joe. Oliver's fall was longer and sadder than that of his predecessors. He began to develop chronic tooth and gum problems which diminished over the last 10 years of his life, his ability to play. After a tough few years after the first band broke up, he formed the Dixie Syncopators more as a band leader and began to work his way back up the ladder. But he was sacked from a stand at the Savoy Hotel after trying to negotiate for far too high a price. His place was taken by Fletcher Henderson's group, featuring ironically Louis Armstrong, and he lost out of a gig at the Cotton Club by playing the same hardball. The gig went to Duke Ellington, which helped launch him to stardom. Gradually his powers waned, his rep deserted him, and he gave up playing music, living and dying in obscurity and penury, forced to sell off all his fine suits and horns in Savannah, Georgia in 1938. But Louis never forgot him. It was he who paid for Oliver's body to be taken to New York and buried in Woodlawn, where Armstrong paid for the funeral of his idol and inspiration. Armstrong paid one even greater act of respect to Oliver. He never ever referred to himself or allowed himself to be referred to as King Louis. As he said, in his mind, Joe Oliver was still the king. Bolden, Keppard, Oliver, and Armstrong. 4 kings, albeit with one too modest to take the crown. 4 men on whose shoulders the early history of the great American musical form was lifted up, and on whose shoulders that music they invented was carried to its funerary bier. A dynasty that went on from that moved our music from a dependency on classic interplay to the age of the golden musical idea, the master soloist. Nothing would ever be the same again.